Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the course on the Patristic period, Fathers of the Church, Christian Antiquity. Picking up where we left off last time, we return to the year 53 AD, the final year in the life of the Emperor Claudius for the commencement of St. Paul's third missionary journey, which extended from 53 to 58 AD, recorded in Acts of the Apostles, chapter 19, verse 1, through chapter 21, verse 17. St. Luke's account of Paul's third journey consists for the most part of his efforts in the city of Ephesus, which a city we visited many times. St. Paul began by going overland from his base at Antioch in Syria to revisit the churches established during his first and second missionary journeys. Quote, "After staying there some time, he left and traveled in orderly sequence through the Galatian country and Phrygia, bringing strength to all the disciples. Paul passed through the upper country and came to Ephesus." That's chapter 19, verse 1. Ephesus endured the cycles of independence, subjugation, shifting ownership, and wartime atrocities summarized that we've visited, or we've summarized with previous cities. Ephesus was absorbed by Rome in 129 BC as a port on the Aegean Sea, as well as the nexus of three major roads on the mainland of present-day Turkey. Ephesus was another wealthy commercial city, like Antioch, Thessalonica, and Corinth, which Paul had already visited. It boasted one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. This was the temple of Artemis, which would cause Paul much hardship. It also had a theater capable of seating 25,000 spectators. And by the time of Paul's second visit to the city on his third journey, Ephesus had a population of 250,000, making it the fourth largest city in the empire after Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch. Paul's Ephesian ministry commenced with an unexpected encounter. 12 disciples of St. John the Baptist, who were not familiar with Jesus. Paul just stumbled on them when he arrived in Ephesus. Paul informed them of the fulfillment of John's prophecy about Jesus and gave them baptism and confirmation. Following his established pattern, despite the routine hardships, Paul reached out first to the Jews, preaching for 3 months in the synagogue that Jesus Christ was the promised Messiah. When the rejection of this by most of them turned into hostility, Paul then shifted his efforts to the Gentiles. Paul and his disciples set up preaching in a lecture hall, the lecture hall of Tyrannus, using it as a base of operations from which Christian communities were established in the region at Colossae, Laodicea, Hierapolis, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, and Philadelphia. And all of that, this is all summarized in the first 10 verses of Acts chapter 19. While in Ephesus, Paul wrote his epistles to the Galatians and to the Philippians. He also became aware of a problem in Corinth, namely stratification between wealthy and poor converts, factionalism centered around different popular teachers, fixation on charismatic gifts, and residual moral problems inevitable in any population, only recently salvaged from pagan depravity. To address these issues from a distance, this is where Paul's on the other side of the Aegean. Paul wrote letters. Now, it's been theorized that he wrote a total of 5 of them, and that not all of it had survived, but that some have gotten combined into the 2 that are in the New Testament. But wherever that worked, I mean, as far as canonically, we're only obliged. I mean, we're obliged to accept what's in the New Testament, and this is a deduction based on internal Paul's own reference to a previous communication. Evidently, one letter preceded 1 Corinthians, warning against associating with those still immersed in pagan immorality. Paul then wrote what is now in the New Testament, 1 Corinthians, from Ephesus, possibly around 57 AD. But it was not well received. He made a brief visit to Corinth, which evidently only made matters worse. He then wrote a 3rd time and had Titus deliver the letter personally to smooth relations. And it was during Titus's absence from Ephesus on this embassy to Corinth that satanic attack against Paul disrupted his Ephesian ministry. After the initial pleasant surprise in Ephesus of an opportunity to complete the Christian initiation of disciples of John the Baptist, Paul then faced the unpleasant surprise of overt demonic interference. Peter, we recall, had experienced this in his encounter with Simon Magus, Acts chapter 8. And Paul himself had contended with this against Elymas on the island of Cyprus, Acts chapter 16. In Ephesus, 2 types of people observed Paul's miracles and sought to imitate them without sharing his faith. Group 1 were wandering Jewish exorcists, and group 2 were pagan magic users, I mean, those who practiced theurgy. So this is Acts chapter 19, verses 11 through 20. Disaster ensued when a demon overpowered and possessed those trying to exorcise it in the name of Jesus. But they did not believe in Jesus. They were just repeating the words, thinking it was some sort of magic spell. This frightening result, for a moment, ignited a display of pagan panic. They created a bonfire in which they hurled many magical books valued at 50,000 pieces of silver. It's Acts 19, verses 18 and 20 through 20. This Ephesian self-extirpation fueled Christian conversions to such an extent that Paul began making plans for the next phase of his mission. He resolved to revisit his European communities in Greece and Macedonia, then visit Jerusalem once more, and then go to Rome. He even sent ambassadors to prepare the way, Timothy and Erastus. sending it from Ephesus to Macedonia with instructions to organize a collection for him to bring to the Jerusalem church. However, demonic counterattack against his success was, of course, inevitable, and it succeeded in forcing an adjustment to his plans. The method of attack, in this case, deployed was manipulation of greed. How often have we seen that? It's such a ready and useful tool in the hands of the demonic. Specifically, visitors, by way of background, visitors to the Artemisian, the temple to Artemis, invariably purchased idols shaped as smaller versions of the cultic totem, not like miniatures of the statue, and also miniatures of the temple itself. Paul's success in turning away a swath of the population from paganism eroded the income of the artisans who made their living from the idol trade. Archaeologists have discovered an inscription at Ephesus mentioning a temple official named Demetrius. While this may or may not refer to the instigator of the riot against Paul, who's mentioned by name in Acts chapter 19, verses 21 through 40, an outburst of demonic-inspired violence against Paul did in fact occur. Macedonian missionaries who had joined Paul in Ephesus nearly lost their lives. Acts chapter 19, verses 29 through 31. And these two guys that were named Gaius and Aristarchus. We meet Gaius again. He's mentioned in Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 16, verse 23. And Aristarchus is mentioned in his letter to the Colossians, chapter 10. Colossians chapter 4, verse 10. Once again, the demonic tactic of stirring violence against Paul drove him away from a church he established because he recognized that personal antipathy against him was causing his fellow Christians to suffer. So he departed Ephesus, traveling overland 150 miles north to Troas, the same port he visited on his second missionary journey to find sea transport across the Aegean to Macedonia. So he did it again to reunite with his first European church at Philippi, where he once again where he was reunited with St. Luke. You remember when Paul had been forced to leave Philippi, Luke stayed behind. So they meet up again in Acts chapter 20, verses 1 and 2. Paul's objectives were threefold. He wanted to visit the churches he had established, reconnect with those disciples, and collect money as a donation to the Jerusalem church. And we find more of his details and background in his letter to the Romans, chapter 15, verses 25 through 27, and his second letter to the Corinthians, chapters 8 and 9. And he intended to travel to Rome and then to Spain. While Paul was getting reacquainted with Philippi, Titus joined them to report a successful visit to Corinth, such that the new church continued to recognize Paul's authority. Paul wrote the Corinthian Christians again, and this is the letter, that 2 Corinthians in the New Testament, in the autumn or winter of 57. Acts chapter 20, verses 1 through 16. Paul based himself in Philippi, making excursions to other churches in the area, Berea, Thessalonica, and Corinth, over the next 3 months. He composed his letter to the Romans in this period as an introduction to the Christians already in Rome. That purpose accounts for the style and the content of Romans as a summary of Pauline theology. He's writing to people who didn't know him. They may have heard of him, and there may have been individuals who knew him, but as a church they hadn't, because he had not founded that church, and so he wanted them to have this synopsis of his teaching beforehand. So that practical reason is what makes the Romans so valuable for us, since we're getting a summary of his thought, intentionally written as a summary of his thought. So Paul's intention was to be in Jerusalem and present the collection from the Gentile churches in time for Passover. He organized quite the delegation. Sopater of Berea, along with Aristarchus and Secundus from Thessalonica, Trophimus of Asia Minor, Gaius of Derbe, Timothy, St. Timothy, whom we met, of Lystra, and St. Luke, the evangelist, who had been ministering in Philippi. The narrative in Acts once more switches to the we pronoun, indicating that Luke had rejoined him in Acts chapter 20, verse 4. From Corinth, the intent was to catch ship for the Holy Land. Now, full-time passenger liners did not exist in the Roman Empire, yet chartering merchant ships in a port like Corinth for a pilgrimage feast, such as Passover, was a mutually beneficial proposition for peregrinating Jews as well as for ship owners. Without a cargo, a kokoros could accommodate 400 passengers, and possibly even more, as Josephus, for example, recorded in his life, his Vita, that he traveled on such a vessel that had 600 passengers sleeping on the open deck. So in that case, in Josephus' case, it might have been a corbita. Although Kokoros did have an open deck, half of it was an open deck. So anyway, between 400 and 600. So this certainly was plausible, and it was something that was done. This also explains how a plot to murder Paul, epiboule is the Greek word used, a conspiracy, could be arranged as they prepared to sail. This is Acts. We're told this word is used in Acts chapter 20, verse 3. Nothing could be easier for determined assassins than a knife in the dark and a corpse over the side in such a crowded, on such a vessel. With a fellowship, Paul had a group with him. Reading the list, had at least, the group was at least 9 people, including himself. So with that many, Paul could easily have organized a turnabout against the conspirators and composed of them in the nighttime waters. But he followed Christ, so, we're not supposed to do that. So the group changed their plans instead, and they took the overland route, which meant it was much longer, so they would not make it to Jerusalem for Passover. But they could still hope to get there for Pentecost 50 days later. As it happened, they went through Macedonia to Philippi and then to Troas, where the calendar caught up with them. And they stayed for 7 days to celebrate Passover in 58 A.D. in Troas. That's Acts chapter 20, verses 5 and 6. St. Luke recorded that in Troas they celebrated Mass together on Sunday, the first day of the Christian week, and afterwards stayed talking together until daybreak. One of those all-night conversations with friends. Acts chapter 20, verses 7 through 12. From Troas, Paul's fellowship sailed south down the coast, probably in a bireme or trireme, as they put ashore on an island, and they put ashore on an island or the mainland every evening. The journey commenced with The journey commenced with 20 miles from Troas to Assos, then 40 miles from Assos to Mytilene, then 70 miles from Mytilene to the island of Chios, then another 70 miles from Chios to the island of Samos, which is where Epicurus was from. You remember we visited that earlier. Then 50 miles from Samos to Miletus on the mainland, 30 miles from Ephesus. So all that summarized Acts chapter 20, verses 13 to 16. St. Paul decided not to dock in Ephesus, no doubt to avoid reigniting hostilities against the Christians living there. But he did want to talk to those, his friends. So he asked the leaders of the Ephesian church, sent a message to them, and asked them to meet him at Miletus, where he made his farewell address to them, which St. Luke recorded in Acts chapter 20, verses 17 through 38. This closed the 3 years of Paul's third missionary journey. And Acts chapter 20, verse 31, enumerated the duration. He addressed them as episcopari, overseers, in Acts 21, verse 28, warning them against false prophets to come. And he coined a Christian proverb: it's better to give than to receive. Acts chapter 21, verse 35. And that's in reference to the collection money that he carried for Jerusalem. Farewells accomplished, Paul and the Pentecost pilgrims purchased passage on a bireme or trireme, 40 miles from Miletus to Kos, then 85 miles from Kos to the island of Rhodes, to disembark 70 miles from Rhodes at Patara on the mainland. That's in southwest Turkey. In Patara, the pilgrims needed to find a ship making the longer journey to the Holy Land. So this means the closest they could get was they have to go back to the large merchant ships, which of course are slower. So that's a Corbyda or a Kykuros, headed for Tyre in Phoenicia, which is present-day Lebanon. That's a 400-mile trip from Patara. Then at Tyre, they could switch back to a coastal vessel, a bireme, a trireme, and then bounce southward, 25 miles from Tyre to Ptolemais, then 35 miles from Ptolemais to Caesarea. In Caesarea, the deacon Philip, remember we met him way back, earlier, when he baptized Samaritans, and he baptized an Ethiopian pilgrim. The deacon Philip, and by this point he had 4 daughters, offered hospitality to Paul and the group. This is Acts chapter 21, verse 8, and brought them up to date on the local situation in the Holy Land. Quote, "We and the people there begged him not to go up to Jerusalem." Acts chapter 21, verse 12. Yet Paul's, he did have a stubborn streak, and his resolve was unshaken. So the journey continued to Jerusalem, even though his friends, including the deacon Philip, advised him against it. So the journey continued. Acts 21, verses 11 through 14. 65 miles overland from Caesarea to Jerusalem, making it in time for Pentecost in 58. Acts 21, verses 15 through 17. Here we have a detail. Luke doesn't elaborate on it, but we can deduce some things, or at least infer some things. It's noteworthy that when the group made it to Jerusalem, they stayed with one of Paul's early converts, Manason, from Cyprus. They did not stay with James or any of the other Christian leaders in the city. So that's Acts 21, verse 16. So James was the leader of the Jerusalem church since Peter's departure 16 years earlier. We learn that Acts chapter 12, verse 17. He presided peacefully over many thousands among the Jews who believed that Jesus was the fulfillment of messianic prophecy. And we're given that number in Acts chapter 21, verse 20. That's a considerable accomplishment on James's part of diplomatic coexistence, considering the martyrdoms of Jesus, Stephen, and another James, the James son of Zebedee. By way of contrast, the 9 years since the Council of Jerusalem approved the Gentile mission without circumcising the Gentiles were littered with violent assaults in response to Paul's preaching. James revealed the cause of this as demonic manipulation, making use of duplicity to attack Paul. Quote, they, and this refers to the Jewish Christians, have been told that you, meaning Paul, teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or observe the customs. End quote. That's Acts chapter 21, verse 21. As Jesus warned in John chapter 8, verse 44, Satan is a liar and the father of lies. And all this was a lie. Paul was not teaching that to Jews. He was teaching to Gentiles. So this slander against Paul was one such lie, stigmatizing him with the crime of apostasy from the Torah, which it is just not supported in the accounts that we have. Paul consistently visited the synagogues first, every place he went, and then he went to the Gentiles. So far from telling Jews to not circumcise their children, Paul had himself circumcised Timothy because Timothy was technically a Jew. Remember the matrilineal descent. That's Acts chapter 16, verse 3. Paul only refused to impose circumcision on Gentiles, such as Titus, which was in accord with the decision of the Council of Jerusalem. Acts chapter 15, verses 23 to 29. St. James proposed that Paul do something to publicly refute this lie by undertaking a public act of respect for the Mosaic law. Specifically, that Paul assist 4 men in fulfilling a Nazirite vow. This is a commitment that Paul himself had done. He had done the Nazirite vow at Cenchreae, the eastern port of Corinth. Okay, so James's proposal was Acts chapter 21, verses 23 and 24. The Nazirite vow, the details of that, are in the book of Numbers in the Old Testament, which of course is the Torah for Jews. Numbers chapter 6, verses 1 through 21. And Paul, the record of Paul having done that, Acts chapter 18, verse 18. He did it himself. So now James is proposing that Paul help 4 others do it. So the vow was a commitment by a man or a woman to a period of asceticism, for the purpose of spiritual renewal and ritual cleansing. It's kind of like a retreat, sort of, although they didn't necessarily. But anyway, it's kind of like that, like an intentional time, finite time for spiritual renewal. During the period of the vow, a Nazirite abstained from all products of the grapevine, either solid or liquid. The person could not cut his or her hair. They could have no contact with a corpse, even that of a close relative, if the relative happened to die during that period. When the time of the vow expired, the person was they were to shave their head and then burn the hair as a sacrificial offering to Yahweh. They were also to make an offering to the temple of a year-old male lamb for a burnt offering, and a ewe lamb for a sin offering, and a ram as a peace offering, with a basket of unleavened bread with oil. So all those requirements are in Leviticus chapter 7, verses 12 and 13, as well as the Numbers chapter 6, verses 13 to 20. The duration of the vow was originally stipulated as 8 days in Numbers chapter 6, verse 10. But it could extend for 30 days or 100 days. Or it could extend for life. Now that was rare, but there were 3 in the Bible, that we're told in the Bible, who adopted this as a lifestyle. Samson, Samuel, and John the Baptist. That's the book of Judges, chapter 13, 4 to 5. 1 Samuel, chapter 1, verse 11. And Luke, chapter 1, verse 15. So listing all the things that were required, it's understandable how, that not everybody could afford to do it. Because for somebody who's not wealthy, so the offering of a year-old lamb, a ewe lamb, a ram, a basket of bread. Well, the basket of bread and oil, that most people, that could be afforded. But to buy 3 animals and to just give them away, to the temple, that, not everybody could afford that. And Paul was suggesting that, James was suggesting that Paul do that to help 4 people do that. So that's 12 animals. So to do what he suggested, Paul would have to go to the temple, pay for the animals and the bread for all 4 men, in order for their heads to be shaven by the priest and their hair burned. If Paul did this, James thought, Jewish Christians in Jerusalem could no longer accuse Paul of apostasy from the Mosaic law. Paul's consent to the humiliation of having to prove his orthodoxy reveals how deeply he wanted it, how deeply he wanted to be accepted by the Jerusalem church. Now, in a coincidence that strains credulity to the point that it could not possibly have been a coincidence, Acts chapter 21, verse 27, tells us, quote, that Jews from Asia, unquote, recognized Paul. Now, remember that Pentecost was a Jewish feast, and they're in Jerusalem. So so these Jews from Asia on pilgrimage to, recognized among thousands of pilgrims, they just happened to recognize Paul. And they instigated a riot by screaming his guilt of the dual crimes of apostasy from the Mosaic law and profaning the temple. Quote, "This is the man who is teaching everyone, everywhere, against the people and against the law and against this place," referring to the temple. "And what is more, he has even brought Greeks into the temple and defiled this sacred place." End quote. Acts chapter 21, verse 28. Now, was this a coincidence? Okay. But by now, if you've been listening to my lecture sequentially, you know my view of the world. I certainly don't believe it was a coincidence. But, let's just... random misfortune, of course, is possible because this is life, and to live is to suffer. Yet, so that's certainly possible. Yet, a more plausible explanation is an ambush orchestrated by the conspirators who had failed to murder Paul aboard the pilgrim ship because they decided to go overland instead. In any case, a riot did happen, and that, of course, is going to draw the attention of the Romans, the local Roman garrison at the fortress Antonia. The officer of the day was Claudius Lysias. He took Paul into custody, saving his life from being mauled to death by the mob. In retrospect, we know this began a period of over 4 years of unjust imprisonment for Paul. Beginning Acts 21, verses 31 to 33. The Romans agreed to bring Paul before the Sanhedrin. Acts chapter 23, verses 1 through 10. For a trial. Paul began by announcing that his conscience was clear before God. The high priest, Ananias, had Paul struck on the mouth for saying this, as once happened to Jesus in similar circumstances. Struck before, this is the beginning of the trial, so before any guilt was legally established. So this, Paul then correctly surmised that this was a drumhead trial. It was a setup. So then he resorted to guile. He announced that his belief in the resurrection of the dead is what brought this persecution on him. Acts 23, verse 6. Now, that is a true statement, but it also served as a magnificent distraction. The Sadducees and the Pharisees were two different, I guess you wouldn't say denominations, but two different groups, two different definite, coherent, identifiable groups on the Sanhedrin. And they, while they did agree on some things, they were believing Jews, but they disagreed passionately on that theological point, on whether or not there was a resurrection. By casting his trial in those terms, Paul then diverted attention away from himself. So instead of everybody fighting him, then the factions started fighting each other about the resurrection, just reviving their old arguments. So when it appeared that violence was going to erupt again, the officer Claudius, had Paul returned to the barracks under protective custody, meaning a continuation of his unjust incarceration. Although under the circumstances, it probably did save his life, at least for a time. The plotters who sought Paul's life since Acts chapter 20 then, quote, bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 who made this conspiracy, end quote. And that's from Acts 23, verses 12 and 13. Moreover, the conspirators had help within the Sanhedrin. Not the whole Sanhedrin. There's no indication of that, but at least there were some members who were. Under pretense of continuing the investigation, the plan was to ask the Romans to bring Paul once again before the Sanhedrin, and this time they'd be ready to murder him by ambush. Acts 23, verses 14 and 15. Somehow, in a way not recorded by Luke, Paul's nephew, this was his sister's son, learned about the plot and warned the centurion Claudius Lysias. Now, but this is not, he didn't, this guy is a Roman. He didn't care about any of this, but he knew Paul was a Roman citizen, so, he couldn't just ignore it completely. He wanted the problem, though, out of his life. Yet he did not want the onus of failing to protect a Roman citizen. So, at 9 p.m. that same evening, Lysias ordered Paul transported under heavy escort to Caesarea on the coast. Acts 23, verses 16 through 24. Now, Paul was from a Pharisee family, so perhaps his nephew was a member of the Sanhedrin, or at least had a friend, who was on the Sanhedrin, somebody like Nicodemus. I mean, Nicodemus is probably deceased by this point, but, somebody like that who was sympathetic. In any case, evacuation from Jerusalem once again saved Paul's life, but at the ongoing cost of his liberty. Lysias could have instructed the escort to put Paul in a ship and see him off, but that's not what he did. Instead, he transferred Paul to a higher officer, kicked it upstairs, to Marcus Antonius Felix, 4th procurator of Judea, from 52 to 60 A.D. Lysias sent along a letter summarizing the circumstances, including the stipulation that Paul was accused of religious offenses only, but that his life was in danger and he was a Roman citizen. Acts chapter 23, verses 26 to 35. 5 days later, the high priest Ananias, with some Sanhedrin elders, arrived. They went from Jerusalem to Caesarea, so these guys really hate Paul. They arrived to prosecute their case, and they brought a rhetor with them, who was a professional speaker, a guy named Tertullus. Acts 24, verses 1 and 2. Interestingly, this creature is not described as an advocatus, which was the proper Roman term for a professional attorney, but instead just a rhetor, professional speaker. History repeated itself again, the customary farrago of lies to which Paul gave his often reiterated defense, and that goes on, Acts chapter 24, verses 1 through 23, so I won't read all that, you know it by now. The procurator listened to the two sides, entirely devoid of interest. His venality was cartoonish. This guy is known from other sources, and he really was he was like a caricature, a cartoon version of the corrupt bureaucrat. His Felix's resident paramour was still technically married to the king of Emesa. She was a Jewish princess bearing the Roman name of Drusilla. She was the daughter of Herod Agrippa I, who had murdered John, son of Zebedee, and tried to kill Peter. Now, Felix, the procurator, was consumed with, lust. I mean, I guess that's the politest way to phrase, consumed with lust for her beauty. So he hired a Median thaumaturge to enchant her into abandoning her spouse. In his defense, so this is the guy, Paul's life is in the hands of this guy. In his defense, Paul committed a costly blunder. He let slip mention of the collection that he had taken up for the Jerusalem church. Acts 24, verse 17. So the procurator Felix kept him incarcerated, expecting a bribe in exchange for release. So obviously Paul didn't have the money on him, or they would have just stolen it. But he was allowed visitors, so Felix thought just by keeping him in jail, without conviction, without actually sentencing him, that Paul would tell one of the visitors to get the money and bribe Felix into letting him go. So Acts chapter 24, verse 26. So corrupt was this guy's governance, it was said that the only prisoners in his dungeon at all were those who could not afford to purchase a gate opening. And we get this from Josephus, a Jewish historian. St. Paul, of course, would not give collection money to a thief like this because he took it up for the faithful. And by this, I'm sure, since he had already been in Jerusalem, I'm sure he had already given it to James, so he wouldn't have had it, neither would any of his people. But even if he did have it, he wouldn't have done it. So he was left to languish in the dungeon in Caesarea for 2 years without having been convicted of any crime. And we're, Acts 24, verse 27. Which brings us, so time passed. So we reach the year 60 A.D. Felix's term in office as procurator ended with his summons back to Rome to answer for charges of malfeasance. Now we learn from Josephus that he purchased his way. He wasn't the only corrupt person in the empire, so he just paid off somebody higher up to get himself out of trouble. And he stayed. Drusilla. He kept Drusilla with him. She died in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 A.D. He happened to not be in the city, so then he found a third wife after mourning for her for a few minutes. His successor as procurator was Porcius Festus. He was immediately confronted by the Pauline conspirators. So this is 2 years later. Paul's still in this dungeon, and so they're keeping an eye on it. The members of the individuals on the Sanhedrin who hated Paul, and now they have a new procurator, so they try once again to get their hands on Paul. So they approached the new procurator and asked that Paul be sent back to Jerusalem for trial, of course intending to murder him in an ambush. Acts chapter 25, verses 1 through 5. Now, Festus was not aware of the plot. Nevertheless, he told them that they could pursue that case. He wasn't going to send him back to Jerusalem, but they could come to Caesarea to pursue their case, and they did. The same thing, repeating the usual catalog of fabrications. After hearing Paul's assertion of innocence, Festus asked if he would be willing to return to Jerusalem to exonerate himself before the Jewish authorities. Now, clearly understanding that agreement to go to Jerusalem would mean just either assassination along the way or yet another drumhead trial resulting in judicial murder, Paul finally, he exercised his right as a Roman citizen and appealed to Caesar. Acts 25, chapter 11. Acts chapter 25, verse 11. Caesar by this time was Nero, emperor number 5, emperor from 54 to 68 A.D., about whom we will have much more to say. So that's 60 A.D. he made his appeal. In the same year, 60 A.D., or approximate in time, another of the apostles suffered martyrdom elsewhere. This is St. Bartholomew, was martyred. Pope Benedict XVI, when he spoke about St. Bartholomew, followed one tradition of interpretation which identifies St. Bartholomew as being the same person as Nathaniel. So it would be Nathaniel bar Ptolemy, so Nathaniel son of Ptolemy, so Bartholomew bar Ptolemy. This Nathaniel came from Cana in Galilee, as we learn, Gospel of John, chapter 21, verse 2, meaning he might have actually been present for the wedding at Cana where Jesus performed the miracle in John chapter 2. In any case, Philip, the apostle Philip, told Nathanael that he had found, quote, him of whom Moses in the law and the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth. John chapter 1, verse 45. Nathanael's dismissive reply Can anything good come out of Nazareth? John chapter 1, verse 46. That sarcastic reply remained preserved in the New Testament. Yet when Jesus saw Nathanael, he commented, "Behold, an Israelite in whom there is no guile." John chapter 1, 47. So, he was sarcastic, but at least you knew where you stood. And this is, well, anyway, okay. And then they have that dialogue, and Jesus says, "Before Philip called you, I saw you under the fig tree." There's that whole passage. And then he replies, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." All right, so moving forward, Eusebius recorded that at the dispersion of the apostles, when Herod Agrippa I was assigned by Rome to be client king back in the Holy Land, they dispersed. At that point, Bartholomew preached in India, where he left behind a copy of the Gospel of Matthew, later discovered by a traveling Christian named Pantinus. After doing some missionary work in India, Bartholomew joined with Thaddeus. After Thaddeus had completed his work in Edessa, which we previously covered, and then together they traveled to Armenia, between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. Bartholomew was martyred by the hideous method of being flayed alive. That means his skin was peeled off. This took place at the former Albanopolis in Armenia. That's present-day Turkey. The reason for this obviously it's Satan, but the specific trigger. He converted the king of Armenia to Christianity, and there were some elements in Armenia that were enraged by this. So a prince, and the account just calls him a prince, so we don't know if that means he was what we would think of as actually one of the sons of the king, or if he was just another important person. But anyway, he's the one that captured Bartholomew, had him tortured, and of course he died from that. St. Bartholomew's monastery is now in ruins. It was an Armenian Christian monastery in a town of Baskale. It's outside of in present-day Turkey, in the Van province of Turkey, which is near the Iranian border, so it's eastern Turkey. The monastery was built on the traditional site of the martyrdom of Bartholomew. In the same time frame, around 60 A.D., the apostle Andrew, brother of St. Peter, was also martyred. Now, we've already quoted earlier about the dispersion, Eusebius, Book 3, Chapter 1, citing his research that Peter preached in Scythia. That's Scythia. Scythia is a general term that was used by the Greco-Romans to describe north of the Black Sea. A Ukrainian historical work, the Chronicle of Nestor, added that Andrew, when he made it to the north coast of the Black Sea, he found the mouth, the river Dnieper empties into the Black Sea, and that he followed it north, which brought him to Kiev in Ukraine. And from there he traveled to Novgorod. So this accounts for the reason that Andrew is the patron saint of Ukraine, of Romania, and of Russia. According to Hippolytus of Rome, who we'll meet later in the course, Andrew preached in Thrace and Byzantium, which was a Jewish colony, and later Byzantium that was a Greek colony. A Greek colony. Now later in the 4th century, the Emperor Constantine would level that old city to put up his new capital, Constantinople. And we're told the tradition is outside of the New Testament, so we're not obliged to believe it, but it's still an ancient tradition that in the year 38 that Andrew installs Stakes as bishop of Byzantium, continuing the apostolic succession just as Peter had and as Paul did. And so that's the that diocese that's considered the parent of the later Patriarchate of Constantinople. And Andrew, along with Saint Stakes, is recognized as the patron saint of that Patriarchate of Constantinople. And Andrew's life was ended by judicial murder, as Jesus's had been. He was crucified without nails. He was just tied to the cross in an X shape in the city of Patras in Achaia, Greece. That's the northern part of the Peloponnese Peninsula. All right. So all that's happening at the same time while Paul is incarcerated for the Caesarea incarceration. So 60 AD. So now back to Paul. While arranging for Paul's transport to Rome in 60 AD, Festus received a visit of welcome in Caesarea from Herod Agrippa II, ruler of Galilee and Perea, along with his sister, Bernice. So this guy was the son of Herod Agrippa I. So Herod Agrippa I, remember, was a grandson of Herod the Infanticide. So this guy's a great-grandson of Herod the Infanticide. And a son of the man who murdered James, son of Zebedee. So this guy, Herod Agrippa II, was a sister of Drusilla, who was a paramour of Felix, the previous guy. So with Herod on this visit was another sister, Bernice, with whom Josephus tells us that he was living in an incestuous marriage. She later became the mistress of a Roman general and future emperor Titus, the guy who destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. For amusement of his guests, Festus had Paul brought before them, without warning, without preparation, and Paul told the whole story. From his story, from being a Pharisee persecutor to conversion to missionary efforts. He preached that the Messiah had to suffer, die, rise from the dead, and that this message must be preached to the whole world. Both Agrippa and Bernice admitted that Paul had committed no crime, certainly didn't deserve to be incarcerated, but Paul had appealed to Caesar, and he had to get out of the Holy Land. Because his enemies had proven to be relentless. They would not rest until he was dead. So, at some point in 60, maybe early 61, depending, Paul was dispatched from Caesarea to Rome. The itinerary was projected to be largely aboard ship. He was in the custody of a centurion named Julius of the cohort Augusta. We're told that Acts chapter 27, verse 1. Luke and Aristarchus accompanied Paul on this journey, masquerading as his slaves, which would have appeared perfectly normal for a Roman citizen in the eyes of the legionary guards, that a Roman citizen would have slaves. From Caesarea, they took a coastal byreme 70 miles north to Sidon in present-day Lebanon. At Sidon, they switched to a trireme to get to southwest Turkey, to the mainland, heading back. On this ship, they hugged the coast 500 miles up Lebanon and Syria, then around the northern side of Cyprus, hugging the southern coast of present-day Turkey, until they docked at Myra, M-Y-R-A, in Lycia. So the Caesarea to Myra, that's Acts 27, verses 1 to 5. At Myra, the centurion found an Alexandrian grain ship bound for Rome. This would have been a Koukouros type, about 180 feet long, about 45 feet wide, could hold 1,200 tons of grain and over 200 passengers, 200 people. Strong winds brought them 130 miles west to the island of Knidos off the southwest coast of Turkey. It was not a propitious place to spend the winter, so they set out again and reached Phoenix on the northwest side of the island of Crete. But instead, that's not where they landed. That was where they wanted to land. Instead, the wind took them 135 miles southwest, where they found shelter at Fair Havens, on the southern side of the island of Crete, near the city of Lasea. Acts 27, verses 5 to 8. With his extensive experience of travel, Paul warned them not to travel this late in the year, just to make camp there. It was around November, as Mare Claustrum. But they ignored him, and they continued sailing west, hoping to round the tip of the island and reach Phoenix on the northwest side. As Paul predicted, a gale blew the ship off course. They were out of control for 14 days, unable to see sun or stars. So that was a significant storm, and hence unable to gauge their location. So these guys, no compasses, no barometers. They threw most of the cargo overboard. Finally, they ran aground on the island of Malta, 500 miles west of Crete, where a statue still memorializes the site of the wreck. They spent 3 months, the rest of the winter, on that 17-mile-long island of Malta. So Fair Havens to Malta is Acts chapter 27, verse 9, through Acts 28, verse 1. When the season passed and they're back to the open sea, they then took ship 85 miles northwest to Syracuse, which is on the island of Sicily. And then 3 days later, they sailed 80 miles northeast for Rhegium, which is the toe of the boot of Italy. It's the southwest coast of Italy, facing Sicily. There they spent the day before sailing north to Puteoli. Remember, that's how St. Peter, that's where he picked up the Appian Way, but Peter had come from the other direction. Puteoli's on the western coast. And by this point, of course, they had all had enough of traveling by ship. So they were happy to see the Via Appia and followed it up to Rome, just as Peter had around 61 AD. Paul was allowed to live in Rome under house arrest. He had only one guard. This was certainly more humane confinement than his 2 years in chains in Caesarea. He was allowed to have visitors and to correspond by letter. And in this way, he became acquainted with the Roman Christian community planted by St. Peter. Paul spoke to Jewish and Christian leaders in Rome, and we're told that in Acts chapter 28, verses 17 through 28. Luke wrote that Paul spent another 2 years in Rome in this way, which would bring his story up to 63 AD. Acts of the Apostles ends very abruptly at chapter 28, verse 31, with the words that Paul, quote, proclaimed the kingdom of God and taught about the Lord Jesus Christ. Period. That's it. Acts of the Apostles just ends with that. Now, it's curious, to the point of just unbelievable that Luke would just stop without recording the fate of the man whose deeds he had devoted so much care to preserve. The most likely explanation that Luke did not finish it is that he was not alive to finish it, because the year after Paul's arrival in Rome, an event occurred that forever changed church history. That was a fire in Rome for which the Christians were blamed, and then that instigated a major persecution, which ended up killing thousands of Christians. But before we get to that, it is during this period, between the Council of Jerusalem in 49 AD and the beginning of the imperial persecution in 64 AD, that we find the first Christian texts from outside of the New Testament, so not biblical, but still ancient Christian text, the Didache and the letter of Barnabas. The first document from the age of the fathers outside of the Bible is the Didache. That is a word that just means teaching, the teaching of the 12 apostles. Now, it does not have an identified author in the text. So nowhere does it say, Gaius wrote this. So we cannot say for certain if it was written by an apostle, by one of the fathers of the church, or just an ordinary Christian. But we must treat it first in any discussion of the fathers because it establishes a written continuity. Remember, that's our hermeneutic, the hermeneutic of continuity, between the New Testament and the patristic writers. Now, for centuries, the Didache was known only through quotations. The later fathers referred to it. Athanasius, Clement of Alexandria. But in the year 1873, a guy who was a scholar, Philotheus Bryennos, who later became an Orthodox Archbishop of Nicomedia, discovered a collection of Greek manuscripts that included the Didache, the letter of Barnabas, the letter of Clement. The Didache, whose complete title he found was The Teaching of the 12 Apostles, Didache ton Dodeca Apostolon. Eusebius mentioned it in Book 3, Chapter 25, Section 4 of his church history. So, it doesn't have an author, as I said. It also doesn't have a date. Just as nowhere does it say Gaius wrote this, nowhere does it say, that this was written in whatever, the sixth year of this emperor. So this dating is a conjecture. And seminarians, if you look this up, if you look up 3 sources about it, you'll get 3 different dates for it. So I'm placing it this early, and I'll give you my reasons. The text of the Didache makes no reference at all to the destruction of the Jewish temple, which occurred in 70 A.D. Nor does it make any reference at all to the persecution of the church by the Romans, which occurred in 64. Now, St. Peter, in his first letter that's in the New Testament, he does make reference to the persecution by the Romans. Not the destruction of the temple, because that happened after he died. And then a later patristic text will cover the letter of St. Clement, who was the 4th pope. He does mention the persecution. So this one does not. So that's why I'm placing it before 64 A.D. The document was written in Greek, not Latin. Which and so where does that put it? Well, the success that Christianity had in Antioch on the Orontes River in Syria, and Antioch being a sponsor of missionary activity, makes that a logical place. It was a Greek-speaking city, and it had intentionally, at least the Christians there intentionally were sponsoring missionary outreach, so that makes it a logical place for a Greek writer to address Greek speakers. The Didache makes frequent reference to the Old Testament. So a Jewish Christian author is a reasonable possibility, like the Gospel of Matthew is, a person who was raised Jew but converted but became Christian. I shouldn't say convert, because it would be a Jew recognizing that Jesus was the fulfillment of messianic prophecy. So a Jewish Christian author addressing other Jews converting to Christianity is a reasonable possibility. The content of the Didache, which we'll summarize presently, are aimed also, it's aimed at converts, so it's not a theological exposition so much as it's a summary. It's like a catechism. That word isn't used, but it's like a catechism, the first Christian catechism. And it also alludes to Gentiles, former pagans becoming Christian. So that suggests a date after the Council of Jerusalem approved the Gentile mission in 49 and ruled that one need not be a Jew in order to be a Christian. So this gives us a hypothetical, of course, but a reasonable, conjectural, chronological range between 49 and 64 A.D. Now, we're not obliged to believe that. Those are my reasons. And seminarians, if you look up other sources, those guys will have their reasons for putting it later. So anyway, what matters is the content. But if it is this early, as I believe it was, then it means it possibly was written before the book of Revelation. Maybe even before the Gospel of John. Anyway, to go deeper, we must look at the text itself. The Didache is pretty short. It's composed of 16 chapters. It's less than 3,000 words long, so you could read it in one sitting. Covers a variety of topics. But more than anything, it focuses on the moral and the liturgical life, as it's a catechism. It explains how one who wishes to follow Christ must live. The Didache was highly regarded by many fathers of the church. Athanasius recommended it to converts, had a great influence on John Damascene, mentioned it. Before the New Testament canon was formally settled, a number of biblical canons, like the Codex Sinaiticus, included the Didache with the biblical text. The Didache begins its catechism with the truth, a simple truth, that there are really only two ways: the way of life and the way of death. That's it. There's no middle position. There's no way that's half life, half death. It's the way of life, the way of death. So there's no compromised theological construction. This is the earliest non-biblical Christian document. The theme is the basics: you choose life or you choose death. And this image of the two ways is correlated. It is, remember the continuity. So it's borrowed from the book of Proverbs, chapter 9, where you also have that. You have the two banquets, one offered by Lady Wisdom, the other offered by the harlot Folly, as a metaphor for the two ways one can live life. The catechism, our catechism, quotes the Didache, quotes that first line, the Didache chapter 1, line 1, in our catechism, number 1696. So that two ways from Proverbs in the Old Testament to the Didache to our current catechism, the two ways, that's still absolutely essential foundational church teaching. Okay. All right. So chapter 1, there are two ways, one of life, one of death. The way of life is this. First, you shall love the God who made you. Second, love your neighbor as yourself. And all things you would not want done to you, do not do to another person. All right, all that should sound familiar. So love of God, love of neighbor. That's Jesus did the same thing. So he took two Old Testament quotes, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 to 5, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, etc., and combined it with Leviticus chapter 19, verses 17 and 18. You shall not bear hatred for your brother in your heart. Go on and on. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. So Jesus combined those two passages in his teaching on love of God and love of neighbor, recorded in Matthew chapter 22, verses 34 through 40. And he concludes, Jesus, so here we have the convenience not only of one part of the Bible providing an interpretation of another, but it's Jesus providing it. So it is as authoritative an interpretation as you can get. He said this is a proper summary, an accurate summary of all the law and the prophets. Then, and of course, the golden rule. You caught that in there. Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. Then the first chapter of the Didache goes on and continues using the Bible for its teaching and providing a summary of the Sermon on the Mount. So continuing the quote. Now the teaching of these words is this: bless those who curse you, pray for your enemies, and fast for those who persecute you. For what credit is it to you if you love those who love you? Do not the Gentiles do the same? But you should love those who hate you, and you will not have an enemy. Abstain from the desires of the flesh and of the body, If anyone strikes you on your right cheek, turn the other cheek to him also. If anyone compels you to go 1 mile, go for him for 2. So you recognize this. It's a summary of Matthew chapter 5, which is part of the Sermon on the Mount, which goes on from Matthew 5 through 7. So I won't read the whole thing, but it's even alms. So prayer, fasting, almsgiving, the 3. Chapter 2. The second commandment of the teaching. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not, it says you shall not be perverse. You remember some of the people they're addressing are pagans and, coming from those cults. You shall not be promiscuous. You shall not steal. You shall not practice magic. You shall not practice sorcery. You shall not murder a child by abortion, nor kill a child at birth. Okay, so this is the earliest surviving written Christian condemnation of abortion, apart from the general teaching in the commandment, thou shalt not kill. So and the Catechism quotes this too. This is in the Didache chapter 2, line 2. Quoted in the Catechism, number 2271. All right, this is the first century. Were you surprised to hear about abortion then? Well, turns out abortion through drugs or through inserting a long needle-like knife into the birth canal was available in New Testament times. It was legal, and it was legal in the Roman Empire. Now, those who did not want to have such a procedure, it was also permitted to expose the exposure, of a child so the child would be born, and then to expose the child. Okay, this is leaving the child outdoors. It was rationalized by these pagan parents that they were not killing it, that they're merely placing it in the hands of the gods. So this practice of exposure of infants was so common that it provided dramatic fodder for the literature of antiquity. The tale of Oedipus, being the most famous. If any of these things have been inflicted on you in the course of your, study of literature, that would have been it, the Oedipus cycle. So with such a moral and legal environment, it's no surprise that the Didache had to make a specific statement on the matter. Okay, apart from religion, what about Roman law? So Roman law did not recognize a fetus as a person. So like today, abortion was legal in the empire. They considered that, life began at birth. Philosophy was more divided. Both Plato in the Republic, Book 5, Chapter 9, and Aristotle in the Politics, Book 7, Chapter 14, suggested abortion as a means of limiting the number of superfluous children. Yet, despite its legality, there were some pre-Christian thinkers who condemned it as being wrong on the grounds of the natural law. The Hippocratic Oath, for example, specifically prohibited it. Stoic philosophers such as Musonius Rufus and Cicero not only condemned it, but approved capital punishment should be imposed on those who intentionally obtain it. Okay. All right. So Plato and the Republic. Let's see, Book 5. This says lines 460 and following. He records a conversation between Socrates and Glaucon, in which Plato has either Socrates did argue this or Plato was just having Socrates put it forward. We already covered that debate. Argue that infants born with any disability must be killed. And he also taught in the Republic, or that taught, but argued in the Republic that women over age 40 who conceive children should abort the child or expose it after birth. Hippocrates, the Hippocratic Oath, reads, quote, on the opposite extreme, then this is an oath of a physician taking this oath. Neither will I give a woman means to procure an abortion. Let's see, Aristotle in the Politics, quote, as to the exposure and rearing of children, let there be a law that no deformed child shall live, but that on the ground of an excess in the number of children, if the established customs of the state forbid this, no child is to be exposed, but when couples have children in excess, let abortion be procured before sense and life have begun. So he does, he personally approves it, but he's saying, if there is a law that happens to be against it, don't break the law. Okay. Cicero. Who was a Roman Stoic, commented, he recorded that one of the laws on the 12 tablets, the original Constitution of Rome, that all extremely deformed children should be killed quickly. A Greek historian, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, recorded. Anyway, you get the point. Skip that. Plenty goes on it. I'm at 2. Yeah, the satirist Seneca. All right. Okay, so you get the point. All right, so the second chapter of the Didache continues, elaborating the commandments. You shall not covet your neighbor's things. You shall not commit perjury. You shall not bear false witness. You shall not speak evil. You shall not bear a grudge. You shall not be double-minded nor double-tongued, for the double tongue is a snare of death. Your words shall not be false or empty, but fulfilled in your actions. You shall not be greedy, nor a swindler, nor a hypocrite, nor bad-tempered, nor proud. And right, you get the point. It goes on and on like that. So just a general, again, this is a catechism, so it's a general, about the way you should behave. Chapter 3, again, keeping the catechism theme. It moves into a different syntax, a different mode of address. My child, flee from every evil thing and from every likeness of it. Be not prone to anger, for anger leads the way to murder. Neither be jealous, nor quarrelsome, nor of hot temper, for out of all these murders are engendered. My child, be not a lustful one, for lust leads to the way of fornication. Neither be a filthy talker, nor of... my child, be not an observer of omens, since it leads the way to idolatry. Neither be an enchanter, nor astrologer, nor be willing to look at these things, for out of all these idolatry is engendered. My child, do not be a liar, since a lie leads the way to theft. Neither be a money lover, nor vainglorious, which is prideful. For out of all of these things thefts are engendered. My child, be not a murmurer. That's complaining, since it leads the way to blasphemy. Neither be self-willed nor evil-minded, for out of all these blasphemies are engendered. Be meek, since the meek shall inherit the earth. Be long-suffering, and guileless, and gentle, and good. And okay, so he goes on like that. You get the point. We'll go. Chapter 4 continues that. My child, him that speaks to you the word of God, remember night and day. You shall not long for division. You shall judge righteously. You shall not hesitate to give, nor murmur when you do. You shall not turn away from him. And okay, so it goes on. Again, it's all, you see, it's all recognizable. Just ethical teachings from the Bible. So hermeneutic of continuity. Idolatry, that's obvious. We've visited that problem so many times. Okay, chapter 5, the way of death. So all that's the way of life. The way of death is this. First of all, it is the evil and full of curse, murderers, adulteries, lust, fornications, thefts, idolatries, magical arts, witchcrafts, false witness, hypocrisies, double-heartedness, deceit, haughtiness, depravity, self-will, greediness, and on and on and on. So it is on and on and on. So you get the point. But St. Paul had lists like that too. So again, this is in continuity with biblical teaching. Chapter 6, against false teachers, and against food offered to idols. Okay, see that no one cause you to err from this. And concerning food, bear what you are able, but against that which is sacrificed to idols, be exceedingly on your guard, for it is the service of dead gods. Okay, so why would this be an issue? You think, okay, if they're no longer pagan, then why would it even come up? Why would they even be in the presence of such food? Well, okay, now we need the context. So, animal sacrifice to pagan gods was a common practice, but only a small amount of the animal would be destroyed in the sacrifice. Most of but the whole animal was given to the temple, so they might examine the liver, for omens, or they might burn the entrails, but the rest is kept, and the priest and the priestesses in the temple and the slaves of the temple would either eat it or sell it. And so in a city like Antioch, or any of these big pagan cities that had many, many temples, large amounts of animal sacrifice, it was essentially impossible to know when you went to the meat market if that meat had been an animal involved in a pagan sacrifice that was then sold to the meat market. All right? So the argument of some Christians might be, so what? Pagan gods do not exist. So no change in the food that was part of a pagan ritual could take place. Like nothing would happen to the food. Any more than the sheep or cattle who might eat grass in a field owned by the temple of some false god. Whereas other Christians, especially those of Jewish origin, recoiled in horror at the thought of eating food that had been part of a pagan ritual. They would see it as being defiled by this, such that it was no better than eating dirt off the ground. So the Didache in chapter 6, line 3, reveals its Jewish Christian influence, and that the writer probably was a Jewish convert to Christianity. By its writing against this, consuming food that had been part of this. Now, the writer's not just making this up. This is in continuity with the Council of Jerusalem. Acts chapter 15, verse 29. Quote, abstain from meat sacrificed to idols, from blood, from meats of strangled animals, and from unlawful marriage. End quote. St. Paul elaborated on this. It is one of the many problems that the church in Corinth was having. 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 through 13. Food is morally neutral. Like food, like a piece of meat, is not capable of offering its allegiance to any god. It's not capable of, bacon cannot say, I worship Zeus or I worship Athena. So in itself, it is, of course, unaffected. It is not affected by the ritual. Since there's only one God, everything created, including those animals, comes from God. Yet, St. Paul cautions recent converts to Christianity who grew up pagan, grew up taking part in such rituals, might be scandalized at seeing Christians consume such food, and dissonance would take place. So this is, you're telling us we can't worship these gods, yet in the temple, eating this stuff that had been part of the ritual was part of worshiping those gods. So which is it? So Paul concludes that while the food is unchanged by the pagan ritual, he advised abstaining from it if consuming it would cause moral harm to the community. So scandal, that word's used a lot, but it has a technical meaning in our Catholic tradition. Scandal means causing moral harm. Morality is the way we live our lives. So scandal, the harm would be causing confusion in determining what is right and wrong, what is permitted and not permitted. Okay, so you can read that, 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 through 13. Okay, Didache, chapter 7, concerning baptism. This can be correlated with our catechism, Numbers 12:13 through 12:84. So this quote from the Didache. And concerning baptism, baptize in this way. Having first said all these things, baptize in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Baptize in living water, which means flowing water. But if you have not living water, baptize in other water. And if you cannot, in cold, in warm. But if you have not either, meaning if you don't have access to running water, to a river or something, then pour water thrice upon the head unto the name of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So that's based on Matthew chapter 28. See, this is all the continuity from the Bible into... now this is one. But before the baptism, let the baptizer fast, and the baptized, and whatever others can. But you shall order the baptized to fast 1 or 2 days before. End quote. But it doesn't define the fast. Okay. So the word baptism is derived from the English word baptizein, which it's an infinitive of a verb which just means to plunge or to immerse. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus began his public ministry by accepting baptism from John the Baptist, even though he didn't need it. It's Matthew chapter 3. The same gospel ends with the command of Jesus to baptize all nations in the name of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, Matthew 28. Now, the reference to fasting in the last sentence is elaborated in the next chapter, chapter 8. Quote, but let not your fasts be with the hypocrites, for they fast on the 2nd and 5th day of the week, but you fast on the 4th day and the preparation day. So that's Wednesday and Friday. Neither pray as do the hypocrites, but as the Lord commanded in his Gospels. Thus pray, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be. So that's the Matthew, from Matthew 6, the Our Father. Thrice in a day, thus pray. So the Our Father 3 times a day. Okay, the reference to fasting takes us back to before Jesus began his public ministry. He went into the desert to fast for 40 days, as recorded in Mark chapter 1. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus specified prayer, fasting, almsgiving as expressing conversion of one's relationship to God and relations to others. Those 3 practices, along with the Lord's Prayer, are considered acts of religion. In our catechism, 1969. And Jesus talks about them in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 6, verses 1 through 18. And, of course, the Didache earlier referred to that because it's summarized in the Sermon on the Mount. But what is a fast? Okay, the biblical definition of a fast was given by Jesus in Matthew chapter 6, verse 16. Quote, when you fast, do not look gloomy like the hypocrites. They neglect their appearance so that they may appear to others to be fasting. Amen, I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face so that you may not appear to others to be fasting, except to your Father who is hidden. And your Father who sees what is hidden will repay you. Okay, the 4th precept of the church is, quote, You shall observe the days of fasting and abstinence established by the church. End quote. That's in the Catechism number 2043. The church also prescribes a fast prior to communion. Catechism 1387 and the Code of Canon Law, Canon 919. So current guidance on fasting. So Jesus just said, don't be like a hypocrite. Don't let anyone know because you're just doing it for God to see. So that's pretty general. But current guidance is more specific. And seminarians, if you refer to the Code of Canon Law, Canons 1250 through 1253, and then track down the footnotes, you will see that it is based on an apostolic constitution promulgated by Pope Paul VI on February 17th, 1966, titled Penitentiae, which means be converted. Okay, which is, quote, and I won't read the whole thing, but, quote, the following is declared and established. By divine law, all the faithful are required to do penance. The prescriptions of ecclesiastical law regarding penance are totally recognized according to the following norms. The time of Lent preserves its penitential character. The days of penitence to be observed under obligation throughout the church are all Fridays and Ash Wednesday. That is to say, the first days of Great Lent, according to the diversity of the rites. Their substantial observance binds gravely. Apart from the faculties referred to elsewhere in the document, that's the faculties to dispense that bishops have and priests in some cases. So apart from that, meaning someone meets the conditions to be dispensed, abstinence is to be observed on every Friday, which does not fall on a day of obligation, while abstinence and fast is to be observed on Ash Wednesday, or, according to the various practices of the rites, on the first day of the Great Lent and on Good Friday. The other rites he's talking about are the Eastern rites. The law of abstinence forbids the use of meat, but not of eggs, the products of milk, or condiments made of animal fat. So, essentially, endothermic, meat from endothermic animals, warm-blooded animals. But it does permit exothermic, cold-blooded, or amphibians, frogs, clams, turtles, that's permitted, should one desire to consume that. Continuing the quote, the law of fasting allows one full meal a day, but does not prohibit taking some food in the morning and evening, observing, as far as quantity and quality are concerned, approved local custom. To the law of abstinence, those are bound who have completed their 14th year of age. To the law of fast, those of the faithful are bound who have completed their 21st year and up until the beginning of their 60th year. Then it goes on by that. Refers to another document, Christus Dominus. Okay, that's enough. You get the point. So fasting, in other words, fasting has biblical foundation, and so all that's changed is the definitions have become more refined. But just the idea, the practice of fasting goes back to the Bible, and in the first post-biblical document, the Didache, it continues that continuity. Now, the Lord's Prayer. The same chapter stipulates offering the Lord's Prayer 3 times a day as a means of sanctification of life. Our catechism quotes that teaching. Didache chapter 8, line 2, is quoted in our catechism, number 2760. Also explains the addition of the doxology, for thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory. Explains that addition comes from the Didache. We still say it at Mass, for the kingdom, the power, and the glory are yours. We still say that. Okay, chapter 9 on the Eucharist, and this corresponds to our catechism, numbers 1322 to 1405. This chapter contains the most ancient Eucharistic prayer outside of the Bible. The scriptural basis for the institution of the Eucharist is, manifold. We have Matthew chapter 26, Mark chapter 14, Luke chapter 22, 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Within that, the section of our catechism, that long section gave you the numbers. Within that section, number 1331, our catechism 1331, refers to two passages of the Didache. Didache chapter 9, line 5, and Didache chapter 10, line 6. The Didache tells us, only baptized Christians gather each Sunday to offer the Eucharist. They follow Jesus' command at the Last Supper, offering the bread and wine. He said, do this in memory of me, so we do it. If he told us to do something else, then we would do that. But he told us to do this, so we do this. And it's a very short Eucharistic prayer, but it verifies continuity between the New Testament and early post-biblical Christian practice. So I'll just read it to you. Quote, now concerning the thanksgiving, this is from the Didache chapter 9. Give thanks thus. First, concerning the cup, we thank you, our Father, for the holy vine of David, your servant, which you made known to us through Jesus, your servant. To you be the glory forever. And concerning the broken bread, we thank you, our Father, for the life and knowledge which you made known to us through Jesus, your servant. To you be the glory forever. Even as this broken bread was scattered over the hills and was gathered together and became one, so let your church be gathered together from the ends of the earth into your kingdom. For yours is the glory and the power through Jesus Christ forever. But let no one eat or drink of your thanksgiving, Eucharist, but they who have been baptized into the name of the Lord. For concerning this also the Lord has said, give not that which is holy to the dogs. End quote. Okay, so the text should sound familiar. I mean, it's the same kind of flow that the Eucharistic prayers. Now we have 4 options for Eucharistic prayers, and of course they're longer. But we have the core there, the bread and the wine. Yeah, okay, and then it goes on. Chapter 10, it goes on. But after you are filled, thus give thanks. We thank you, Holy Father, for your holy name, which you caused to tabernacle in our hearts, and for the knowledge and faith and immortality which you made known to us through Jesus your servant. To you be the glory forever. You, Master Almighty, created all things for your name's sake. You gave food and drink to men for enjoyment, that they might give thanks to you. But to us you freely gave spiritual food and drink and life eternal through your servant. Before all things we thank you, that you are mighty. To you be the glory forever. Remember, Lord, your church, to deliver it from all evil, and to make it perfect in your love, and gather it from the 4 winds, sanctified for your kingdom, which you have prepared for it. For yours is the power and the glory. Let grace come, and let this world pass away. Hosanna to God. If anyone is holy, let him come. If anyone is not so, let him repent. Maranatha. Amen. But permit the prophets to make thanksgiving as much as they desire. Okay, chapter 11, concerning teachers and apostles and prophets. Again, the Didache, basing its teaching on that of Jesus' well-known warning, Matthew chapter 7, verse 15, beware false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but underneath are ravenous wolves. St. Peter, in the second letter of St. Peter, chapter 2, verse 1, there were also false prophets among the people, just as there will be false teachers among you, who will introduce destructive heresies and even deny the master who ransomed them, bringing swift destruction on themselves. Many will follow their licentious ways, and because of them the way of truth will be reviled. Okay, so this is what the Didache has to say about it. Quote, whosoever, therefore, comes and teaches you all these things that have been said before, receive them. So you see, receive before, even there, the Didache, which is a document of continuity, is emphasizing continuity, that which was handed on, the tradition which was taught before. But if the teacher himself turn and teach another doctrine to the destruction of this, hear him not. But if he teaches so as to increase righteousness and the knowledge of the Lord, receive him as receive the Lord. But concerning the apostles and prophets, according to the decree of the gospel, do thus. Let every apostle that comes to you be received as the Lord. But he shall not remain except one day. But if there be need, also the next. But if he remain 3 days, he is a false prophet. And when the apostle goes away, let him take nothing but bread until he lodges. But if he asks money, he is a false prophet. And every prophet that speaks in the Spirit, you shall neither try nor judge, for every sin shall be forgiven. But this sin shall not be forgiven. All right, it's a pretty sweeping statement. Okay, so what are they talking about? These are itinerant, what St. Benedict would later call the Vaghi, the Hierovaghi. These are just wanderers who were claiming to be prophets, claiming to have special revelations from God. So, and there's a real danger of that. I mean, they might be true, but maybe it won't be. Maybe they're just trying to exploit, So he's warning about it. Even that 21 centuries ago, there was still had people trying to scam, trying to make money off the faith from the faithful. All right, chapter 12 goes on about that and expands it. Apart from those who are claiming to be prophets, but also those who are traveling claiming to be Christians. Maybe they're not. So then that warning there. Chapter 13, the same. Okay, chapter 14 speaks of the Christian assembly on the Lord's Day, on Sunday. So the Sunday Eucharist in our catechism, numbers 2177 through 2183. The first precept of the Church is attendance at Sunday Mass. That's in the Catechism number 2042, and in the Code of Canon Law, Canons 1247 and 1248. Didache, quote, but every Lord's Day, gather yourselves together and break bread, and give thanksgiving, after having confessed your transgressions, that your sacrifice may be pure. But let no one that is at variance with his fellows come together with you until they be reconciled, that your sacrifice may not be profaned. For this is that which was spoken by the Lord. In every place and time offer to me a pure sacrifice, for I am a great king, says the Lord, and my name is wonderful among the nations. Okay, did you catch that? Prior to Mass, all present must confess their sins publicly before the Christian community. Now, these are the meeting houses, as we've already seen how Paul organized things. So these are, small groups, but still, it's kind of jarring. Now, we can verify this retroactively, the public confessions, by finding the document that ended the practice of public confessions. And this document was written by Pope Leo I in 459, addressed to the bishops in Italy, in which he commanded an end to the practice of public confession. Quote, there should be no public confession of sins in kind and number read from a written list, since it is enough that the guilt of conscience be revealed to the priest alone in secret confession. End quote. So the practice of public confession, attested in two places in the Didache, chapter 4, line 14, and chapter 14, line 1, alarming though it may be, is verification that the earliest post-biblical church made pastoral and sacramental use of the church's authority to forgive sins. Now the ritual has changed. Instead of just reading the list of the sins committed by the people there, it's now done individually with the priest. So the ritual has changed, but the content, the theology has not changed. Okay, chapter 15, the hierarchy. Therefore, appoint for yourselves bishops and deacons worthy of the Lord, men meek and not lovers of money, and truthful and proven, for they also render to you the service of prophets and teachers. Despise them not, therefore, for they are your honored ones, together with the prophets and teachers. And reprove one another, not in anger, but in peace, as you have it in the gospel. But to every one that acts amiss against another, let no one speak, nor let him hear anything from you, until he repents. But your prayers and alms and all your deeds do so, as you have it in the gospel of our Lord. Okay, the Didache mentions bishops and deacons. That's chapter 15, line 1. Now, the omission of priest should come as no surprise. With the community so small, the bishop was able to meet the sacramental needs of the people in terms of the Mass, leaving administration of the works of charity to the deacons. It would be later, when the Catholic population expanded, that bishops shared his priesthood with what we now call priest through the sacrament of ordination. The ordained priesthood existed since the Last Supper. The apostles were endowed with the fullness of the high priesthood. It was the apostles who appointed deacons, Acts chapter 6, and it was the successors, the bishops, who later shared their responsibilities with priests. And all that summarized in the Catechism, numbers 874 through 945 on the hierarchy, and on holy orders, numbers 1533 through 1600. Okay, last chapter, chapter 16, is on eschatology, is on the end times. Quote, watch for your life's sake. Let not your lamps be quenched, nor your loins unloosed, but be ready. For you know not the hour in which our Lord comes. But often shall you come together, seeking the things which are befitting to your soul. For the whole time of your faith will not profit you, if you be not made perfect in the last time. For in the last days false prophets and corrupters shall be multiplied, and the sheep shall be turned into wolves, and love shall be turned into hate. For when lawlessness increases, then shall hate, and persecution, and betrayal increase. Then shall appear the world deceiver as the Son of God, and shall do signs and wonders, and the earth shall be delivered into his hands, and he shall do iniquitous things which have never yet come to pass since the beginning. Then shall the creation of men come into the fire of trial, and many shall be made to stumble, and shall perish. But they that endure in their faith shall be saved. And then shall appear the signs of truth. First the sign of an outspreading in heaven, then the sign of the sound of a trumpet, and third the resurrection of the dead. Yet not of all, but as it is said, the Lord shall come, and all his saints with him. Then shall the world see the Lord coming upon the clouds of heaven. End quote. Okay, so the second coming. And the current catechism, our catechism, number 1001, discusses this second coming, called the parousia, or the parousia. A similar sentiment is expressed in the next non-biblical or post-biblical document, or maybe not. Well, anyway, the next early Christian document outside of the Bible, the letter of Barnabas. Like the Didache, it may have been, following this reconstruction, and if it really was written by Barnabas, it could have been, certainly was written before the book of Revelation, and maybe even before the Gospel of John. The two documents, the Didache and the letter of Barnabas, have very different styles, but their antiquity and their different places of composition give us priceless insights into the life of the first century church. Okay, the letter of Barnabas consists of 21 chapters. The text of the letter, like the Didache, does not have a date or an author. It was attributed to Barnabas by St. Clement of Alexandria and by Origen, both fathers of the church whom we'll discuss in due course. Tertullian, another father of the church, believed that Barnabas, St. Barnabas, whom we've already met, Paul's first missionary journey, Tertullian believed Barnabas was also the author of the New Testament letter to the Hebrews, which also does not include a name or date. So this is a quote from Tertullian, quote, "For there exists also a letter entitled by Barnabas to the Hebrews, but a man sufficiently authorized by God, since Paul put him beside himself in observance and abstention. For it is only I and Barnabas who have no power to forbear working. At any rate, this letter of Barnabas is better received by the churches than the apocryphal shepherd of the adulterers." That's the shepherd of Hermas. I'll explain his joke. We're going to cover the shepherd. That's another later document. Eusebius recorded the belief of Clement of Alexandria that the letter to the Hebrews was written by Paul, quote, "written for the Hebrews in the Hebrew language," and that it was later translated by Luke into Greek, which is how he explained, Clement explained, the stylistic similarities between the Gospel of Luke, Acts of the Apostles, and the letter to the Hebrews. Clement explained the omission. Said, okay, well then, St. Paul identifies himself in many of his other letters. Why doesn't he with this? Well, Clement explained it because it was written to Jerusalem, to the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem, and as we've seen, there was a lot of animosity towards himself, so he didn't want that distraction, so he didn't bother attributing it to himself. While Clement of Alexandria regarded the New Testament letter to the Hebrews as written by Paul, he recognized the letter of Barnabas as written by Barnabas, and identified it, that this Barnabas was one of the 70, that he was the co-worker of Paul. And let's see. And this letter of Barnabas is found in the Codex Sinaiticus, which is a 4th century biblical text, but this is included with it. Now, as the text is silent itself, no name and no date, and the church is not pronounced on the matter, we are free to accept or reject that attribution. It certainly is not in the part of the Bible, so we're not obliged to. However, it's quoted in the Catechism as the letter of Barnabas. And there's no reason Barnabas could not have written it. Barnabas was a Jew of the tribe of Levi, born in the island of Cyprus, heard the gospel preached by Jesus himself, became a follower of Christ. In the year 40, he was living in Damascus, where he met Saul, later Paul. 3 years earlier, in 37, Paul had been present for the murder of St. Stephen the deacon and was on the way to Damascus to destroy the church. But on the road, he had an encounter with the risen Christ, as we all know. In 45, we've already covered the first missionary journey, so I won't repeat all of that. And then for the second journey, Paul refused to forgive Mark for leaving, but Barnabas forgave him, and so then they split. Paul took Silas, and Barnabas took Mark. During Paul's Roman imprisonment over a decade later, Paul met Mark once more, who by this time was working with Peter, and they were reconciled. He was never reconciled with Barnabas because by that point Barnabas was dead, according to tradition martyred by stoning in Salamis, a port on his home island of Cyprus, which leaves us with a date of death 61 or 62 A.D. at the latest. That's nearly a dozen years after Paul and Barnabas separated. Considering how much Paul accomplished in those 12 years, it's certainly plausible that Barnabas traveled to Alexandria, preached the gospel, and composed a letter written to that church, much as Paul dispatched letters to the churches he founded. This is supported by the decision of Mark, Barnabas' cousin, to move to Alexandria after the first persecution ended with the death of Nero in 68. Mark preached the gospel there in Alexandria until his own martyrdom in 106. He was martyred by being dragged to death. St. Mark, he was tied behind a chariot and just dragged up and down until he died. The thesis of the letter of Barnabas is that the Jews, any Jew who refused to accept Jesus as the fulfillment of messianic prophecy, has just misunderstood. In reality, the Torah, the writings, and the prophets, what we now call the Old Testament, was a prelude to the coming of Jesus. From this, and from the historically documented presence of a large Jewish community in Alexandria, where Philo lived, for example, who we've already met, it's reasonable to infer that Jewish Christians in Alexandria were having problems with Orthodox Jews who refused to accept Christ, just as Peter had in his first Roman residence and as Paul had in so many cities. In terms of content, chapters 1 through 17 of the letter of Barnabas summarize a Christocentric interpretation of the Old Testament. So this is typology. The last 4 chapters, 18 through 21, are another version of the two ways teaching that appears also in chapters 1 through 5 of the Didache. So typology. Typology is still a legitimate method of Catholic biblical interpretation, summarized in the Catechism, number 128. The Church, as early as apostolic times, and then constantly in her tradition, has illuminated the unity of the divine plan in the two Testaments through typology, which discerns in God's works of the Old Covenant prefigurations of what he accomplished in the fullness of time in the person of his incarnate Son. Catechism number 129. Christians, therefore, read the Old Testament in the light of Christ crucified and risen. Such typological reading discloses the inexhaustible content of the Old Testament, but it must not make us forget that the Old Testament retains its own intrinsic value as revelation, reaffirmed by our Lord himself. Besides, the New Testament has to be read in the light of the Old. Early Christian catechesis made constant use of the Old Testament. As an old saying put it, the New Testament lies hidden in the Old, and the Old Testament is unveiled in the New. So this, when he said early Christian catechesis made constant use of the Old Testament, what we've just seen. We've seen an example with the Didache, how many times it refers to the Old and the New. Okay, the letter of Barnabas also makes use of allegory, which is also a permitted Catholic method of biblical interpretation. Catechism number 117. The allegorical sense. We can acquire a more profound understanding of events by recognizing their significance in Christ. Thus, the crossing of the Red Sea is a sign or type of Christ's victory, and also a sign of Christian baptism. That's just an example. Okay, a few passages from the letter of Barnabas. Chapter 2 deals with the nature of sacrifice. By uniting a reference to Jeremiah chapter 7, verses 22 and 23, on the abuse of worship, meaning offering sacrifice with the heart not properly disposed, uniting that with Psalm 50 on an acceptable sacrifice, Barnabas argues that Jews who refuse to accept Jesus as the Messiah misinterpreted the nature of animal sacrifice that they were continuing to make. They felt that the offering was an end in itself, rather than an externalized act reflecting an internal reality. He says the whole point of sacrifice is to create within us an attitude of contrition. a pervasive awareness of the evil in the world, of our weakness and our tendency to surrender to it, therefore our need to atone, and our desperate need of God to help us resist it. Okay, moving on, chapter 4 refers to the covenant. Moses went up Mount Sinai, stayed there for 40 days. In that time of separation, he achieved the internal spiritual conformity to the will of God necessary to allow him to bring down the covenant for others. But even while he was receiving the covenant, the Israelites rebelled. They couldn't even wait 40 days. And then Moses broke the tablets of the law. That covenant was broken. What was left was nothing more than a covenant of hope fulfilled in Jesus. Now, I know seminaries, that's oversimplified, but it's a short letter. And that's his letter, chapter 4, lines 7 through 9. I mentioned it because in this context, the Catechism quotes from this chapter. In the Catechism number 1905, quotes from the letter, chapter 4, line 10. In keeping with the social nature of man, the good of each individual is necessarily related to the common good, which in turn can be defined only in reference to the human person. And here's the quote from Barnabas. Do not live entirely isolated, having retreated into yourselves, as if you were already justified, but gather instead to seek the common good. End quote. Let's see, moving down, chapter 7, on Jesus prefigured. The practices, Barnabas says, the practices which Jews were ordered to enact each year were designed as visible manifestations, prefiguring the saving event of Jesus. Apart from the prophets, who came long after Moses, Jewish sacrificial ritual was given to them as a command, so that each year they might see and partake in the truth, so that one day they might understand. For example, if the hearts of Jews had been opened, Barnabas contended, they would have seen the role of Jesus plainly in the sacrifice of Yom Kippur. When Leviticus 16 commanded that each year they take 2 goats, one to sacrifice, one to drive out into the desert, they believed that they had done their duty atoning for their sins and prayed for the expulsion of evil in their midst. But Barnabas says this, while that was true, in the Old Covenant, but it was also a prefiguring of what Jesus would do, his overcoming of sin and his redemption of us. Okay, then he goes on allegories, goes on and on with this. For example, Leviticus chapter 11, the prohibition against eating swine, eagles, hawks, crows, fish that have no scales. He interpreted this allegorically as meaning that we are to avoid men who act like pigs, who only call out to their master when they're hungry, and then when they're satisfied, ignore him. By abstaining from eating eagle meat, hawk meat, or crow meat, Barnabas said Moses was advising the people to abstain from being thieves or parasites who do not earn their living. Just as said birds, they don't earn that, they just swoop in and steal it. And by avoiding fish that swim only in deep water, Moses advised us to never allow ourselves to live in the mud like those who've turned away from God. So he goes on and on like that for 9 chapters. But that makes the point. For him, every line of the Old Testament contained hidden meaning accessible to those who read it through the eyes of the New Testament. Okay, the 2 ways. Barnabas concludes his letter, chapters 19 through 21, as the Didache began, with an discussion of the 2 ways. And in this section, there's another quote in our catechism from the letter, Catechism number 2271, quotes from this section because here Barnabas, like the Didache, includes a specific condemnation of abortion. We already discussed that, so I won't repeat it. Okay. So all of that took place while following the chronology that we're doing. That it would have taken place while Peter and Paul were still alive, before their martyrdom. So and they were both martyred, according to tradition, on the same day, in the same year, in the same city in Rome, during the during Nero's persecution of the church, from 64 to 68 A.D. So we'll move on with that. Let's see how long we've been going. Okay, so we'll stop here, and then we'll pick up with that. It began with a fire. The city of Rome burned down, starting on July 18th, 64 A.D. So we'll pick up with that next time. For now, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.